Well, I guess also the ciphers themselves are quite interesting, and I've heard a lot of people talk about the symbols in the ciphers being, you know, quite exotic, and I don't really think they are. I think they're really a combination of a couple of things. In drafting for landscape architecture, we have symbols and codes used for lights, which is a zodiac symbol. We have the true north point, which is a zodiac symbol with part of it done with a thicker line to show north. There are so many symbols in those ciphers that are just really standard documentation symbols for drainage pits, lights, so on and so forth. The other thing is I have seen from other websites things like the little kids, I think it's the American Junior Justice Society, where there's a circular code thing, and the lettering on that is, and some of the symbols are very similar to the ciphers. But I think it's really interesting that the ciphers would require a light table, and not many professions actually use light tables, or how do you have access to them? And I think, again, if someone was a student and they had access to a light table at the university, it's far easier to stay at university late at night. It's much easier to come and go and use a light table when no one's around than it is in an office environment. So you need that sort of thing. And I also believe that with drafting, there's an opportunity for the Zodiac to not leave fingerprints. Now, I know he left a palm print, I think, on the Exodus letter and maybe a few other prints here and there. But when I used to draft when I was younger, particularly when I'm drafting with pencil, I used to put tissue just underneath my hand, and that stops the sweat and smudging of the graphite from the pencil. That would be a really easy way for the Zodiac, with that drafting knowledge, to be able to prepare these things. And he wouldn't even have to stick on the ciphers. He could use weight bags, that are these bags filled with lead that hold the paper down, and then you can draft your symbols. So there's a lot of preparation in those letters, in those ciphers. Really focused my research mainly on the main crimes of LinkedIn, Riverside. Once it gets sort of beyond the early 70s, I tend not to focus on it. It doesn't mean that it may not be him, but we have to remember these crimes happened in actually a really short period of time. It was less than a year from Lake Herman Road to Paul Stein's murder. And sort of just on that, I know I'm segueing a bit, but I almost feel like the Paul Stein murder in San Francisco was two things. Primarily, it was to take heat off Vallejo. There was things happening in Vallejo and there was heat there. And that's a real easy way to just take it away from Vallejo Police Department. Let's bring in San Francisco Police Department. Let's take it over the city. And let's start escalating things up to bombs and blowing up buses. It takes it away from a local murder to somehow almost terrorism in that sense. By the time you get into the sort of mid-70s and some of those later letters, who knows? Maybe he's not paying attention to that as much. There's certainly not the same focus. I think there was a real focused area between late 1968 and the early 70s where he was really focused on getting a result. And maybe to bring it back to Ron Allen, I sort of think it's interesting that he was finishing up his degree at University of Berkeley probably around August of 71, and then started into the workplace. And before that, there was already this feeling of the Zodiac changing to the citizen. So his life sort of matches up pretty well with certain key stages of activity and where things were happening and why. And it's sort of very interesting. I think there was this real focus for about a year and a half with the letters, where he was really spelling out and bringing this thing to a citywide level. And again, it was never really alleyways and buildings or an old industrial estate. It was always parks, open space, the urban edge. Again, like I said, with Presidio Park, he's gone into the park. There's connections there that I think he can't help himself. He's someone who's familiar with those sorts of sites. He's familiar with those sorts of areas. When it gets to things like the Exorcist letters and that sort of things, I'm probably less focused on them. One, because I know that I can't perhaps authenticate them as much. Also, perhaps I think he's maybe waning in his potency of his vision, that maybe he's moved on to something else, but he still needs to keep it alive. And perhaps he's got a bit sloppy with this sort of thing as well. Whereas early on, He was putting out quite a lot of graphic information, the bus bomb diagrams and the ciphers. He wasn't sending these beautiful ciphers much later on, and perhaps that even comes into conjunction of where he had access to a light table. He had access. Zodiac might have had access to a light table at university, but then maybe in the 70s he starts working and he doesn't have that opportunity and means anymore. Not only do I believe that the Zodiac was a landscape architect and planner, I also think he was a student. There's a lot of, circumstantial evidence in the letters that alludes to someone that is, above high school and is not a child or really young, but someone who's not been in the grind for a while. There's talk about buttons, which is very much UC Berkeley and university campus sort of rhetoric. So I sort of had a look at Cal Poly, the course there, what kind of classes they're doing a course. And I just find it incredibly interesting that he moved from Pomona, again, which is very close to, Riverside, back to Vallejo, literally a few months before the crimes happened, and was living in Aragon Street, 6 minutes from the Blue Rock Springs murder site and 9 minutes from the Lake Herman site. So what are the odds that you've got someone who's a landscape architect, urban planner that's just moved back to Vallejo, that does drawings and would be coming out of university where there are elements of those bus bomb letters which are student-orientated workplaces. Don Chaney had finished university earlier in the 60s and started work, and I think Sandy Panzarella as well. But Ron Allen was a student for a long time, and that gives you, ideal freedom of movement. You don't have work records to worry about. You've got these ideal opportunities, and you're thinking in a way that's very three-dimensional and very visionary, that could allude to someone taking on the persona of Zodiac. And it could work both ways. I mean, I think the Zodiac operated alone in doing the crimes. If you looked at a group dynamic, there's certainly things on those documentaries where there's suspicious ways in which certainly Don Chaney is talking about, and it feels like Sandy Panzarella is just there to back him up. And everything that Don Chaney says is very black and white. And Ron's mentioned, but he's never interviewed. So you don't really get that whole full side of the story. So who knows what happened with that group. But if there's deceit from Don Chaney and Sandy Panzarella is making a statement saying, I believe Don Chaney, if he says it, it's true. And then if you've got Ron Allen, when he was interviewed in the early 70s, saying Don Chaney, he's a responsible person, if he says something that's true, they're kind of backing him up in a way. And I just find that incredibly odd. That's just really strange. So, for Don Chaney to go on these documentaries and make these statements, I think it's really odd when you don't have the full picture. Now, Ron Allen has his right to privacy and may not want to go on the show, but at the same time, that whole documentary is throwing Arthur Lee Allen under the bus. And there's no defense. Now, if I was part of the Lee Allen family, I'd kind of want to use that opportunity to exonerate the family and put a positive message forward. And if Ron Allen's a landscape architect, urban planner, I know that he can come up with a really good narrative to project a really more truthful aspect of Arthur Lee Allen, if it wasn't him, and put his name thing. And of course, if he's innocent, he'd have no trouble going on a documentary with some of the victims and witnesses to the crimes. But I find it extremely strange. And again, I must point out that I don't know if they would have been able to see these bus bomb diagrams and that drafting at the time, but it's fairly certain if they were part of that film that they would have eventually got to know that. And certainly Don Chaney seems to have kept up with the case and has talked about things. I kind of think that he's taken the piss, to be honest. And if there's deceit from Don, then there's deceit to Sandy. There's a really famous murder case that's actually happened fairly close to where I live called Ivan Milat that happened in the early 90s, late 80s, the backpacker killer. And the first thing the police looked at when they were trying to get tips from the public is they just only really looked from tips from a region that was revolving around roads and routes and how someone might move very efficiently to the crime scenes and where they might live. This idea of people flying in or going up to San Francisco, I think is very difficult. I think the other thing is, again, there's just no evidence of an engineering or mechanical engineer in those letters. They're far more creative. The way the cards are done, some of the language or the descriptions and that visionary approach is much more conceptual. It's much more three-dimensional and spatial. The reality is at Cal Poly, Don Chaney would have been studying mechanics and thermodynamics, kinetics, metallurgy, much more sort of precise and mathematically orientated courses and subjects than, say, a landscape architect. You take the population of Vallejo from 1969, which is 66,000 people, and I went and found the percentage of landscape architecture in the population. Actually, on modern data, it's about 0.009% of the population are landscape architects. So if we applied that modern figure, so we give the benefit of the doubt going back to Vallejo, it turns out there's about probably 3 or 4 people would be landscape architects in Vallejo at that time. So it may not necessarily be him, but it's a pretty strange small pool when you look at that. So I can't really say for 100% anyone, whether it's Ron Allen, Arthur Lee Allen, or anything like that, because, and I don't know if anyone else can really with any of their suspects. There's just not enough evidence or proof. But I think in the balance of probability, when you look at a number of different factors, and there are other factors too, like we know that Arthur Allen was a pretty stocky guy, and sometimes he was looked at as the Zodiac because of eyewitness descriptions. Now, Ron's related and fairly similar looking, but was younger. There's a few interesting things in some of the eyewitness accounts that at least make me think that Ron Allen is a much better suspect than Arthur Lee Allen. I can't say that means he's the Zodiac, but I think in the balance of probability, there's a number of things that weigh up that just make me bravely curious about him.